What if the start of Abraham's faith journey wasn't rooted in obedience, but in separation? What if God's first move wasn't to grant favor, but to create distance? Why would a loving God ask Abraham to abandon more than just his country or his security, but even his father? What secret lingered in the shadow cast by Terah? Why was this father the very first thing God needed removed? We often remember Abraham as the great father of faith, but few stop to ask, what did he need to let go of to become that man? What chains had to be broken, and who really was this man named Terah? This isn't simply about Abraham's divine call. It's a story about what had to be cut loose, the burden of inheritance, the steep cost of obedience, and the unfinished stories of a father's past. Because before the covenant was formed, a fracture came first. Before there was a blessing, there was a break. To become the father of many nations, Abraham had to lose his own. This is the untold account of Terah, the man who had to be removed for the promise to unfold. Stick with me, because by the end, you might just see that the road to God's promise often begins with a painful departure. But before we go further, type this in the comments: I won't stop in Haran, I'm going all the way to Canaan. Because before we had Abraham, we had Terah. Not a priest, not a prophet, not a patriarch, just a man. A name handed down the bloodline like a breath: Terah. A man remembered not for what he completed, but for what he left undone. Genesis 11:26-32 gives him barely a mention, a few verses at best, a short entry in the lineage of promise. But beneath those verses lies something deeper, a shadow that still echoes through Abraham's calling. Because here's the mystery: the very father of faith emerged from the household of an idol worshiper. How do you reconcile Genesis 12, which tells Abraham to leave his father's house, with Joshua 24:2, which says plainly, your ancestors, Terah included, served other gods? Not Yahweh, not the God of covenant, but the deities of Terah lived 205 years, and yet, in that entire lifetime, there's no mention of a covenant, no altar, no offering that pleased the Almighty, only silence. But oh, that silence, it speaks louder than sermons, louder than hymns, louder than praise. Because the quiet surrounding Terah speaks volumes. He fathered sons but offered no spiritual direction. He started moving, but never reached the end. Genesis 11:31 says he set out for Canaan. But instead of continuing, he stopped and settled in Haran. That's where he died, a man who began heading toward destiny, but never stepped into it, a father who only went halfway. If this is hitting home, drop a comment now. Let me know you're still with me, because we're just getting warmed up. Now, back to it. Abraham didn't just come from a man who served idols. He came from someone who froze when God needed momentum, and here lies the conflict. Abraham's call wasn't just about heading to a new territory. It meant stepping out from under the shadow of a father who couldn't finish the journey. Terah wasn't a side note. He was a spiritual hindrance, and God had to clear the path before pouring out the promise. Because sometimes, to hear God's voice, you must silence the echoes of the voices before it. Before the land of promise. Before covenant. Before faith. There was and there was sin. Not sin as in wrongdoing, but sin, the moon god. The chief deity of a pale, distant god, worshipped in temples built by pride, in rituals that chained generations to spiritual darkness. Terah lived under that shadow. He wasn't just caught up in culture, he was active in it. Joshua 24:22 doesn't mince words. Your forefathers, Terah, Abraham's father, lived beyond the Euphrates and worshipped other gods. That wasn't accidental, it was deliberate. Repeated. Deep. Terah wasn't a bystander. He knelt before the very spirits Abraham would later be called to defy. He raised his sons in an atmosphere soaked with compromise. He fathered by tradition, not by revelation. And that's key, because your origin will always try to decide your outcome. Ur of the Chaldees was more than a location. It was a mindset, a rich and rebellious society, drenched in luxury that looked up at the moon and chose to worship its glow instead of the one who created it. Terah was shaped by that system, molded within it, devoted to its ways. But here's the strange beauty of God. He doesn't start his story in purity. He chooses to plant the seed of faith right in the heart of idolatry. The power of Abraham's call isn't just that he obeyed, it's that he stepped out from the shadow cast by Terah. Terah wasn't just his father, he symbolized everything old, man's religion, man's ego, and gods that couldn't speak. And if Abraham was ever going to become the father of nations, God first had to detach him from the father of idols. That separation wasn't harsh, it was grace. It's what made faith possible. Sometimes before God plants promise, he must sever the roots of false gods. He had to bring an end to the old to begin the eternal, and so a line is drawn, on one side Terah, on the other Abram. But the story still has a twist, because the real question is, did Abraham leave his father behind by choice, or did something happen to remove Terah from the journey? What if Abraham wasn't even the first to start the walk of faith? What if the first steps toward the promise weren't his? Genesis 11:31 flips our assumptions. It says Terah took Abram, Lot his grandson, and Sarai his daughter-in-law, and they left Ur of the Chaldeans headed for Canaan. Hold on. Terah? Terah was going to Canaan? The idol worshiper? The one God later passed over? He was the first to move? That's no small detail, that's a warning. Because Terah began the journey, but he didn't finish it. When they reached Haran, they stopped and stayed. Genesis 11:31 says it plainly. He paused, he settled, he remained. The journey that began with promise ended in stagnation. Haran, a place whose very name means delay, dryness, or drought. A halfway zone, a place of spiritual stillness. That's where Terah breathed his last, not in open rebellion, but in hesitation, not in sin, but in unfinished obedience. He wasn't evil like Nimrod, not corrupt like Sodom. He was just almost faithful, and almost was enough to miss destiny. How many are still living in Haran today? They've left Ur. They've stepped out of blatant sin, walked away from the idols, the family patterns, but they haven't arrived at Canaan. They're frozen, caught between. A faith that began, but never fully yielded. A vision that started, but died incomplete. And this is where danger hides. Almost obedience is still disobedience. Doesn't matter how far you've come, if you stop just before the promise. Haran is the land where dreams go unfulfilled, where comfort becomes a cage, where calling gets traded for convenience. And many never leave that place. Not because God abandoned them, but because they gave up too early. Terah had the direction from God, but not the devotion in his spirit. He led Abraham the right way, yet his hesitation became Abraham's pause. And that's where the next part begins. Because what the Father couldn't complete, God would call the Son to finish. But first, death had to make room. Haran, a word meaning scorched, empty, lifeless. It was meant to be a brief pause. But it turned into a permanent stop, a barren land wrapped in the comfort of routine, where vision fades away and divine purpose sinks beneath the surface of ease. Haran mirrored Ur in appearance. It had shrines, trade routes, and daily rhythms. But it wasn't Ur, and it surely wasn't Canaan. It was the in-between, and here's the heartbreak. Terah abandoned Ur's gods, but built fresh altars in a foreign space. You might walk out of Egypt, but has Egypt truly left your heart? Terah released the past with his hands, but his soul still clung to it. That's why he never moved forward, not because the path was too difficult, but because comfort meant more than calling. Haran whispers the most tempting message: "You've come far enough. No need to continue. No need to press further. You've already gone farther than others. Isn't that sufficient? But Canaan still lay ahead, and here's a truth that never changes. God's covenant won't grow on rented ground. Faith doesn't deepen in mimicry, and divine purpose won't blossom in the soil of almost. Haran is where surrender turns into stagnation, dressed up like holiness, where halfway obedience gets mistaken for holiness, where generational mandates hit pause until death clears space for fresh purpose. Terah was never wicked, but he loved ease, and that was enough to stop God's plan in his lifetime. He brought Abraham close to the promise, but only God could lead him in. So Haran became a tomb for the father's faith, and a launchpad for the son's real purpose, because God often waits for something to end before he starts again. Then the Lord said to Abraham, "Leave your country." But why now? Why not before, back in Ur, or while they were still in Haran? God's voice stayed quiet, not because he disappeared, but because the timing wasn't right. Sometimes divine timing stalls, not from a lack of purpose, but because the environment remains polluted. Genesis 12 doesn't start until Genesis 11 finishes, and Genesis 11 closes with a death. Terah's passing had to happen for God to move forward. He wasn't just Abraham's dad, he was a shadow that wouldn't fade, a leftover piece of the world God wanted to break, a man molded by foreign gods. Even as he walked beside one marked for sacred altars, God waited for quiet, because divine instructions can't echo through old influence. They must arrive pure, free from mixture. Terah's end wasn't just natural, it was a holy release. The background noise of his presence had to go for heaven's frequency to be heard. God couldn't raise a people on ground still tied to yesterday. Terah delayed the promise, not by rebellion, but because his life still held the pull of the past. Abraham's purpose demanded a break, and that break didn't begin in a city. It began in a burial, because before God leads us forward, he often cuts something away. Before heaven speaks clearly, it silences the old sounds, the comfortable voices, the cultural pulls, the emotional roots that shape us more than God's word. And when Terah was gone, that silence turned sacred. Then God spoke, "Now Abraham, it's time to go, because a promise can't grow where the ground is still defiled. It waits until the soil is pure. Leave your land, your kin, and your father's house." Genesis 12:1. God didn't mumble. He spoke with intention. 3 layers, 3 bonds to break. Country.family. Father's home. This wasn't about geography. It was identity. A holy tearing, a spiritual separation from a home unfit to carry heaven's weight. Because a father's house isn't just bricks and beams. It's structure, a culture of ease, a legacy of idols, a bloodline baptized in loyalty to moon gods. And God said, "Walk away." Why? Because you can't claim tomorrow while holding on to yesterday. The promise had no room in a house built on spiritual shadows. The blessing couldn't be birthed in a compromised atmosphere. Terah's house was filled with memories, but God was preparing something brand new. And to begin that foundation, God had to strip Abraham of all he knew. This wasn't just about reaching a place, it was about reshaping a soul. Faith isn't born with motion. It starts with disconnection from anything trying to hold you back. God wasn't just pulling Abraham ahead, he was pulling him out. Out from tradition, out from bloodlines that corrupted his purpose. That house had history. But it couldn't hold covenant. Some inheritances must be surrendered to receive what heaven gives. This wasn't rebellion. It was rescue. To become the father of nations, Abraham had to walk away from the house that raised idolatry. The break had to be full. No halfway steps. No circling back to old voices. He couldn't be the child of promise while still bowing to the gods of Terah. Two men. Same blood. But totally different callings. One began a journey, the other completed it. One honored idols, the other honored God. One lived halfway, the other gave it all. One was tied to the culture, the other stood in covenant. This isn't just a tale of travel, it's a story of finishing. Because legacy doesn't belong to the one who starts the race, but the one who finishes it. Terah saw the road, but never saw the mountain. He had vision, but lacked resolve. He heard the call in echoes, but never touched the promise. Why? Because God doesn't place covenant on polluted soil. Terah still carried the altars of Ur. He reflects every person, every structure, every system. That begins with spark, but fades in safety. That steps in faith, but stops for comfort. That senses calling, but never moves its feet. Terah wasn't wicked. He was settled, and that can be deadlier. God won't sow destiny where false gods already rule. So he waits. He observes. He lets one fade, so another can rise. Abraham wasn't just called. He was tested, and he kept stepping. Where Terah sat, Abraham pressed forward. Where Terah knelt to idols, Abraham raised altars. That contrast reveals truth. Faith isn't passed down like property. Destiny isn't automatic. Obedience isn't inherited. You must choose to finish what others only dreamed. You must decide to walk until the end. Because the blessing isn't given to starters. It's reserved for finishers. Those who keep going when the path gets narrow, when the price is high. There's a deep divide between inheritance and deliverance. One is handed down, the other is fought for. When God called Abraham, he wasn't just forming a nation, he was cleansing the source, because God won't build eternal things on broken ground. Terah's house had rituals, had memory, had roots, but it also had idols. So when God said, "Leave your father's house," it wasn't cruelty. It was consecration. Abraham didn't just step away from geography. He shattered a generational cycle. Because certain promises remain locked until the chains that held your bloodline are broken. And sometimes that deliverance comes wrapped in loneliness. Abraham didn't have a roadmap. No crowd to cheer him on. No signs to confirm his choice. Just a whisper from heaven. And the courage to trust it, and in that sacred silence God began drafting a legacy that stretched beyond one man. Abraham became a second Adam, not in Eden's garden, but in the rugged soil of obedience. He was the blueprint of spiritual rebirth. A man who said yes to God by saying no to everything safe. Because sometimes saying yes to heaven means betraying the expectations you were raised with, so you can remain loyal to the anointing placed on your life. And in breaking from tradition, you are freed from repetition. God wasn't just after Abraham's footsteps. He wanted his legacy. He wanted to start clean. To plant something holy that hell itself could not touch. But that seed needed fresh ground, untainted by the residue of compromise. So the man had to be left behind. The house had to be abandoned. The pattern had to die. Because if you stay bound to the familiar, you may miss what's eternal, and until you've felt the ache of separation, you won't know the weight of glory. This isn't just about Abraham, it's about all of us. Because somewhere between Ur and Canaan, we all meet at crossroads. And the question is, who are you? Are you Terah, the visionary who started but never finished? Or are you Abraham, the one brave enough to burn the blueprint and follow the voice into unfamiliar land? Haran still breathes, not as a city, but as every place we've stopped short. Where vision faded, where fatigue replaced faith, where comfort disguised itself as calling. Haran is the halfway house of destiny. But covenant can't grow in compromise. So, ask yourself, what are you still holding on to? What must be left behind so the promise can begin? You can't bring Terah's ghost into Canaan. You can't worship on new altars with hands still clinging to old idols. You can't step into the next while gripping what God already told you to release. This isn't a question of miles. It's a matter of mindset. God is still separating, still speaking, and sooner or later you'll have to choose to stay rooted in what raised you or rise into who you're becoming. So, who are you in this story? If this hit deep, if something cracked open inside you, if a whisper said it's time to leave Haran, don't scroll away. Like this video if God spoke to you. Drop a comment below. I'm walking out of Haran. Let that be your first step toward something sacred. Subscribe so you never miss another hidden truth buried in your Bible. Because what God's doing here, this is only the beginning, and if someone you love is still stuck, still bound by a house God left long ago, send this to them. This might be the message that shakes their chains loose. This isn't a channel backed by empires, it's fueled by people like you. So if this blessed you, become a supporter or simply share it. Because somewhere, someone is still sleeping in Terah's house and doesn't yet know that Canaan is calling. For more like this, watch the next video on screen. This is Black Faith Tales. Thank you for watching. God bless you.